Hello gamers, welcome to a robust style DSP video. I want to discuss his level 1 podcast. Now I think I did a video about his podcast like last year or so, whatever. But there's more I want to say now. Because if you look at it today, and you look at the views, it's not doing as well as it used to do. Not even for trolls. Like, trolls used to go to the Level 1 podcast, listen to just the nonsense that DSP would say, but now, there's really nothing there, and no one really goes to it, because they'll just wait for the clip channels to upload it, like Snort Hogan, Hate Army, Aquateal, Snort Burnell, etc., etc. The list will probably go on. And that saves a lot of time. And that's not really a good thing for DSP, because if other people are providing a more digestible way to watch the podcast, that just shows an issue with the source material. And that's not to say that, DSP should just do individual recordings of his podcast or anything like that. The issue is that there's no organization that makes the podcast feel organic. A lot of people who watch podcasts, they don't watch them for a special guest, because no podcast needs a special guest, but they watch them just to hear what's going on in the person's life, like what movies they've been watching, if they've been watching TV, that kind of stuff, and just listen to their stories and all that kind of stuff. It's nothing deep or meaningful or anything like that. It's just kind of like, I want to see what's going on in this. Do they play this game? I want to know what their opinion is of that game. I wonder, or whatever, and they just watch it, and then they might talk about the video that they made if they're a video content creator kind of guy, whatever. There's all these kind of reasons why people watch podcasts. Then there's more structured podcasts, like a murder mystery podcast, a podcast that talks about a certain show specifically, that kind of stuff. So you look at DSP's podcast, and what does it offer? It starts with an intro to an intro to an intro, then the show. Then he talks about like either how his stream's been going, or how much money he needs to make, if he needs to make money, or any pressing matters that is really important for him to talk at the beginning of the show. Then he talks about the schedule for like an hour. Then he talks about gaming news, if there is any. Then he does Q&A, ACA, shoutouts, and if there's nothing going on, he just sits there and stares at chat until something happens. Like, it's just nothing that is captivating. And when people start to criticize the podcast, he just doesn't really have a way to fix it, because he's not that interesting. The only thing you get interesting podcasts from him is if there's controversy in the gaming industry, or it's his day off segment. But his day off segment is also becoming more and more just boring, because it's just him complaining about DoorDash all the time and what food he ate. It's nothing interesting, and it's just him complaining about what's going on. They don't talk about the shows they watch. They don't watch anything interesting, honestly. And I complain about that all the time. And again, I don't want to sit there and say, well, no one should be watching nature documentaries, or that this and that. But there's nothing else that they're watching that's interesting. And when they do watch something that's interesting, we never know about it, or it's something lame and whatever. And this is gonna be an issue going on and on with Level 1 podcast, where it just kind of seems more of a Frankenstein's monster of what a podcast is to him. Where now you just look at it, and it just kind of looks like a madman just kind of putting on a show in front of a camera, and he thinks this is what a podcast should be. Like, we have an intro. Okay, most podcasts has intros, get it, but do you really need the stream starting intro? Then him doing like a little mini schedule of the podcast intro, to the intro, then to the show. Like, do we need all those intros? Like, isn't it a little redundant? But no, the other one's to let you know he's gonna talk. Then he talks, then another intro plays, and then he talks again. Like, do we really need all these intros? Like, no one does that. You go to anyone else's stream, they just have like a little slideshow or whatever the fuck, and then they just kind of talk about what they're gonna do, then they get going. DSP just has all this nonsense that he doesn't really need, and it just kind of just inflates what's going on with his podcast, because he has nothing else to talk about, so he just kind of stalls and meanders. And it's nothing interesting to listen to, especially how he talks, where he's just kind of rambling, and he says, And it's like this is your podcast, and that's how you want to conduct yourself. And then he just gets lost in the stream chat randomly. Like, he'll just be talking. Like, oh, I'm going to be playing Armored Core 6. It's going to be a great game, okay? I don't know. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to be playing Armored Core 6. And it's like, you're reading stream chat and responding to something without giving the context to the viewer, so it just makes you look like a scatterbrained idiot. And it's like, this is how you want to conduct your podcast. Like, I watch some podcasts and I don't see them just randomly just sitting like, all right guys, we're gonna be talking about like Xenoblade Chronicles 3. It's a really good game. Yeah, okay, so yeah, Xenoblade Chronicles 3, it's a good game, it's solid. Okay, that's it, you're fucking banned, enough of this. And it's like, this is what people watch. And his chat is full of larpers and like disingenuous fans, so he's not gonna really get the feedback he needs. And then the people who are genuine fans, they either just don't care or they're just like, they think this is what good content is because DSP said so. So he's never gonna get genuine criticism about it, and he's never really gonna improve. Really go back and watch his old pre-streams and then compare them to the podcast today. They're night and day, where it kind of almost sounds like he was an actual person talking in the past, and now he just is this weird guy that's just on camera, and it's like he never like talked to people before or did a stream in his life, because it's very scatterbrained. Like, there are times where people lose their train of thought, and that's fine, but if you're trying to conduct a show, you want to minimize how much you lose your train of thought or lose your focus. And DSP has done this consistently, where he loses focus and he just kind of meanders in how he talks. He says a lot of ums, and then he just looks around to God and he's like, oh, this and that. It's just not entertaining. And then when he wants to address something, he mocks people just randomly. And then it's weird that he intersperses random bits of toxicity when he wants to talk about the gaming community. And these are seemingly his colleagues or just people in the same kind of community he's in. And he mocks people for any menial things. If some people think that Blanca's top tier, he'll shit on you for it. Now, in fighting games, tiers, I would argue, to me, is more subjective than most. I mean, there might be some factual tier rankings for characters, but for the most part, I would argue some of them are very subjective. Like, some people might say that Blanca is mid tier, some say it's high tier, whatever. But if someone thinks that he's a high tier character, these will shit on you and say you're an idiot. But it's like, what's your response to that then? How is he not a high tier character? It's just, he doesn't really give any compelling responses. Then when he does the Q&A, he doesn't really give any meaningful answers to any of the questions he's getting. It's just, no, I haven't played that game. And then he gives you like facetious answers, then he gives you overthought answers for certain stuff. Like, it's just, there's nothing in his podcast that makes you want to just kind of tune in and listen to what he has to say. And a lot of the times, it's nothing that you want to take seriously. I've talked about the Game of the Year nonsense he did last week, and his Armored Core 6 opinion and all this stuff. That's just nonsense. And it just kind of seems more of him complaining about other people's opinion on something. Like, is this what people want to tune into a podcast to listen to? Especially for a guy that brags how he's so meaningful and positive and all this stuff, that they go to a guy and he's like saying, these people think this game is going to be Game of the Year? What a bunch of idiots. That's not going to happen. And it's like, why are we talking about other people's Game of the Year or how other people are interpreting their Game of the Year in like August? Why not just talk about what you think is going to be Game of the Year? Or why not talk about the games that you've been playing or something or anything? Why not talk about the shows you've been watching with Kat? Why not talk about stuff that's a little more interesting than just nothing? And it makes it more disingenuous to see him just talk about anything. Does anyone really want to go to DSP for gaming news? And he has this news bumper, and it doesn't work. A lot of stuff that he does would work if there's a second person at the helm switching scenes for him, because every time he wants to switch to a scene, he has to lean forward and and move over, which kind of takes away from the flow of the podcast. And it just, a lot of the times, I put the stream on as I'm playing like Guilty Gear or just another game, and randomly I would just hear dsvita stop talking. I'm like, is the stream buffering? What's going on? Just to find out he's doing this, like, DSP News! And it's also ridiculous that he has a new slide saying DSP News. And he says, welcome to DSPN News. So it's DSPNN. So what's the first or second N stand for? Like, it's just all this redundancy. And the gaming news isn't really that important. Then he will complain that, oh, I'm not Kotaku, I'm not Polygon, I'm reporting stuff, so why are you holding me to such high standards? But it's like, you're conducting your gaming news as a news segment. And of course he's gonna say, well, it's a joke, it's silly, but it takes a lot of time out of the stream to do. And you want to say that this is a silly thing in your whole podcast? And even like, I think I talked about this before, but it's kind of nonsense for him to say that, oh, I named it a podcast so people can't complain that it's going on for too long. It's a podcast. But podcasts have as a hard stop point at any point. If, like, you know, Mega 64, for example, they have a podcast, they go about it, then they have an after show. Sometimes in the after show they take Discord calls, but sometimes they don't if they don't have the time, if the equipment's not working with them, whatever the fuck. They just kind of just don't do it. They don't waste time sitting there staring at each other until the time runs out for them to hit end show. Sometimes their podcast is an hour long, sometimes shorter if there's really nothing else to talk about. They don't force their podcast to be super long because it has to, because it's dictated by the universe that a podcast is X amount of time. A podcast could be a lot of things. Now, of course, to kind of focus on the SOK for a bit, their podcasts were like 5 hours long. Yeah, that's all too long, and people can make fun of that. Now, did you see the SOK say, this is a podcast, of course it's gonna be 5 hours long, okay? I mean, they probably had other stuff going on, but it was 5 hours of, like, you know, SOK shit, but people complain that it was long even to them. And DSP saying, like, why are you complaining that my podcast is an hour long, man? But it's like an hour of information that either doesn't need to be in the podcast or it goes on for far too long. Because at some point, when you start just staring at chat in silence, that's not worthy time. And DSP talks about how he values his viewers' time. He doesn't want to waste their time. But when he sits in front of a camera and sits there in silence, that's wasting their time. And especially when after that he goes on break. So it's like, why are we sitting here in silence to just sit in silence again? So his podcast is complete garbage content that I don't know how he can fix it, because if he wants to really fix it, he has to really just be okay with ending his stream, his little podcast, you know, at least at an hour or whatever, and not be such a redundant person and focus on what he wants to talk about, and not just sit there and just stammering around and going through the schedule 1,000 times and all this stuff to the point where it just becomes white noise. Like, there's stuff that he says in his podcast that I just kind of tune out and I just kind of forget what's going on. It's just kind of nothing content. You might as well just watch paint dry and you'll get more out of it than his own podcast. So I don't quite understand how any of his fans, his genuine fans, can genuinely tell me with a straight face that the podcast is a great form of content. If anything, people are just there hoping that he's gonna have another rant, or that they just are tolerating it to get to the gameplay because they don't want to get yelled at by DSP when they say the podcast goes too long. And he doesn't listen to that feedback and think about what they're actually complaining about. When they say the podcast is too long, maybe you should interpret that as, well, maybe I'm a little bit roundabout in how I'm talking, or maybe some of the talks drone on for far too long than they need to. Like, it's just kind of weird in that kind of way, and he doesn't really address the feedback very well. So that's what I want to talk about. His podcast is fucking junk. It's not that interesting to listen to because he doesn't play games off stream to even talk about. Remember when he talked about Street Fighter Duel for one day on his little podcast and that was it? We never heard anything else about it. Like, why doesn't he talk about other stuff? Like, he doesn't want to game off stream because he doesn't want to burn himself out of gaming, but he lives with his wife that's also a gamer. They don't want us to play games together or anything like that. There's all these couch co-op games he could be playing, and he doesn't want to do them with Kat on their own time. That could have been something he could talk about on his podcast, but instead we hear, oh, Kat's been playing Skyrim for 1,000 times, and she found Jasper in the game. Like, okay. So, yeah, his podcast has nothing of value as much as he wants to tell everyone in the world that his podcast is so meaningful and has so much value and meaning. It doesn't. It has nothing going for it. So, hopefully maybe one day he'll make a better podcast. I doubt it because he's one guy and he's very complacent. He's a very complacent person. I've said this ever since he started KO Gaming. He does something, it does very well. He has one chance of success, and he doesn't really continue that success and build on it. He plateaus and stays on that course and thinks that it's going to always be a success because the first one was. And that's not how it works. Super Mario Brothers was a great game, and it was fantastic, but if Nintendo put out that same game every year, no one's going to care about Mario. So that's why you see all these different Mario games or whatever to compare it to video games or, compare it to a restaurant. Imagine a restaurant, dude, giving you the same food every day. Like, yeah, it's, the food is good, but I don't want to eat this food again. So I'm going to go to another restaurant that has something else on the menu that I'll eat and has more variety in it. And it's funny, now that I talk about variety, that his podcast has no variety to it. If you think about it, there is no variety in it. It's about him, it's about the games he's playing, and the game news stories he finds. There's no variety in topics, there's no variety in interests, there's nothing going on in his podcast. So it's even more ironic the more you delve into what is wrong with his podcast, because it's such lazy content. And it's like the perfect example as to what is wrong with DSP's content in general. It's all lazy nonsense. But his podcast in particular is just doomed to start pulling in fewer numbers as time goes on. Like, at some point, it's going to get to the point where he will be thirsty for drama. And I feel you could kind of start to see that. Because these rants, they have been feeling really forced. To the point where it's just kind of, you really have nothing to talk about? And it's funny that he complains about all these other YouTubers who have nothing better to do, so they focus on drama and all this stuff, but what has DSP been talking about in his podcast lately? Oh, the trolls are mad that I'm enjoying Armored Core. What a bunch of idiots. Oh, the trolls are saying Blanca's top tier. He's not. What a bunch of idiots. Oh, I did good in Armored Core 6 on the hardest boss, and the trolls say that I'm an idiot. Wow, and it's just him complaining. He complains about people picking their game of the year by the end of the year, I guess. He's complaining about Armored Core 6, he's complaining about this, he's complaining about that, and these complaints are just forced. It's really insane because he says that the trolls are trying to form a narrative because there's nothing going on in DSP's life for us to make fun of. But his podcast has fallen into that same pitfall that he claims detractors have fallen into, where there's nothing going on, so he has to figure something else to complain about. There's no drama going on in his life, so what does he have? Oh, I must complain about the trolls in some way, in some roundabout way that there's some kind of conspiracy going on. It started with Amnesia. He thinks it was a troll conspiracy to get him to play Amnesia. He picked the game. He then said the whole time, he's not sure he wants to play Armored Core 6. He may not like the game. He plays the game, and people are like, wow, he doesn't like the game. Wow, I'm surprised. And he's mad about it. Like, what is this dude going on about? Every time he goes on his podcast, like, at some point we're gonna get to a day off segment, and he's gonna complain that the DoorDasher drove in an ugly car or some shit. Like, oh guys, this guy he drove in a smart car. Who drives in a smart car, man? And it's like, what are we doing? And that's what DSP's podcast has fallen into. And I remember back when the whole thing with Twitter was going on, he told us, he claimed that it was going to be such a hard feat to get gamer news on Twitter because of what Elon Musk did to the site. There's a lot of issues with Twitter that's been fundamentally broken, and, you know, it is what it is. But it has not been that hard to find gamer news on Twitter. I've been able to find gamer news pretty easily, to the point where I'm more informed on gamer news than DSP is. And DSP claims he gets paid to have a nice podcast, and he can't figure this stuff out. Like, he gets paid to be a gamer, and he has no interest in anything that's happening in his own space. How is this dude a gamer if he has no passion or interest in what is going on? And he brags about how he goes into each game cold. Oh, I try to avoid spoilers, but he watches all these gamer events anyways. He watches all these trailers anyways. So how is he going in cold anyway? Like, he isn't. You know, on a very basic terminology of it, he's not going in cold at all. But whatever, it is what it is. I do think that his podcast is going to start getting worse and worse to the point where his entire stream will just take a massive hit. His gameplay content already took a hit. Everything took a hit. But it's just going to get worse and worse and worse to the point where I don't know what's going to happen. It's going to be to the point where he's going to start forming random conspiracies about his own fucking chat, I guess. I don't know. But it's just astounding how bad the podcast has become for him that I just don't know how he did it. Because it was the one thing that was going for DSP that thought, you know, maybe the podcast is going to be the one thing that people are going to at least be indifferent about. At least be lukewarm about. But it's just not a good podcast that he has put out. There's nothing there, and he's just forcing it. It really feels obligatory. Every time he does the podcast, it just feels like he's going through the motions to get to the gameplay. And then when you get to the gameplay, that also feels like he's going through the motions. And honestly, I will say, I do think that he generally enjoys Street Fighter 6. He does enjoy Chrono Trigger to a point, but, you know, he's already kind of losing faith in Street Fighter 6, especially that he has to rely on such cheesy characters. It's just a mess. So that's what I wanted to talk about. Thank you for watching. Thank you for sticking in for 23 minutes of me discussing the level 1 podcast and how it's just gonna be downgraded to level 0 at this rate. But that's it. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.